Get ready to meet one of the great American anarchists, because this time around we are talking about Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman. You're listening to Champagne Anarchism. Let's get into it. Alright, welcome to this channel. If you are new here, my name is Justin. I read through great works of leftist literature piece by piece. We will read along with this book, so this is the intro lecture. If you are interested in signing up for this, completely free, you can join the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Trying to get a little bit of a discussion going over there, so please do join. It would be awesome to see you there. And in any case, welcome to this incredible book. We have just finished with Herman Chomsky's incredible Manufacturing Consent not that long ago. So to mark the new year, we are getting into some anarchist philosophy finally. And this is almost the best starting point, because Emma Goldman, as she is a genius, but she's also a deeply controversial figure. A lot of people have opinions about Goldman. And so to get into this, and also to get into this book, which is an essay collection at the end of the day. This is not Kropotkin, this is not Bakunin, this is something that's a little more accessible. So you can actually sit down and read through these essays in the modern day and appreciate them just as much as when they first came out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I meant what I said at the start. Emma Goldman is one of the great American anarchists, even though she was born in then the Russian Empire. We're going to get into all of this. We're going to look at how to read this book. We're going to look at some historical context, and then we're going to talk about who Goldman was and get into her biography. It is a fascinating biography, so we'll go through all of that, and then at the end we'll talk about some of the major issues and themes that she's dealing with in this book and in the rest of her work, and just things to look out for as you go in and read this book with modern day eyes. You know, reading Goldman is a bit like opening a box of fireworks or setting off a box of fireworks, because you're not really sure what you're going to get, but you're pretty sure it's going to be spectacular and then maybe a little dangerous. Goldman lived and worked at a historical crossroads at kind of the turn of the 20th century, and some of the things that she lived through were just earth-shattering events. We're talking about the breakup of the First International. We're talking about World War I and the fall of Tsarist Russia. We are talking about the Spanish Civil War and the early beginnings of kind of this great American empire that's about to emerge. All of this is happening, and she is there as a key figure throughout all of it, as we are going to see from her biography. She was also, as you will see, just a massive contradiction. She was a very jealous lover who at the same time was preaching free love. She was an ardent feminist, but she would go and speak out against the movement for women's suffrage. She made enemies and friends just as easily, and she fought her entire life for some new world, something different, and by the end of her life she could kind of see that slipping away. So this is a dramatic story and a dramatic thing to be reading here. You know, during her time, and even now a little bit, she was relegated to this kind of secondary status, particularly against her more famous male European anarchists, people like Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin. She was kind of relegated into this female sphere. But Goldman, as you will realize, deserves a place at the very top. Since this is a reading guide, we should talk a little bit about how to read this book. As far as anarchist texts go, this book is fairly reader-friendly. It's quite short, and it contains very little jargon, but at the same time, I would recommend reading this with a notebook. As always, I always say this, you know, sit down, get yourself a notebook, and take actual notes. Write down just a couple lines. What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What do you understand from this? What do you think? What does this mean? What kind of questions does this bring to the surface? However, having said that, as opposed to something like Manufacturing Consent, this is something where you can kind of sit back and relax, just kind of enjoy being in Emma Goldman's world. And should you need a little bit of historical context, and I certainly found this as I was reading this is a reread for me, but as you come across the historical events and a couple of names that she mentions, you may be tempted to just go to Google and find out a little more about that. Do not resist that impulse. That's a fantastic impulse, and it will lead you in really interesting directions. We will cover some of the background here, but There's only so much that you can cover in a video like this, so if there's more that you want to explore, please get into it and let me know what you find, as always. There are 3 things that we should know to set the stage for this historical context that Emma Goldman arrives into. She was, as I said, working at this fascinating intersection of history. It begins around the tail end of the 1800s and into the first half of the 1900s. This is an extraordinary period of just intense upheaval. So we're going to talk a little bit about industrialization and then the First International, and then we also need to know a little bit about the Haymarket Affair, because this really informs her thinking and is one of the sources of her early radicalization, the Haymarket Affair. So first things first, when it comes to industrialization, we are talking about a different point in history. We just came from manufacturing consent, where we're talking about the 50s to the 70s. This is set much later. All of this is happening in a context of rapid industrialization that starts in about the early 1800s and particularly goes into the second half. Just in Europe and the Americas, you see factories proliferating across the world. And that meant new sources of income, certainly, but it also meant really horrible and miserable lives for working people. We are talking long hours, we are talking unsafe conditions, we are talking meager wages. All of this is the norm, and it creates this stark inequality between the wealthy industrialists and the working poor. You may have heard of this period as the Gilded Age, and if you read a book like The Great Gatsby, you will understand a little bit what this dynamic looked like. In fact, throughout American history, the Gilded Age was the high point of inequality until now, until the present day. And when you read Goldman, just think about those modern historical parallels, because they matter. Either way, this heavy industrialization creates the conditions necessary for a wave of strikes and protests, and all of that lays the groundwork for what's going to come later, with all these labor movements rising and political radicalism. And that takes us to 1864, which is the First International. Now, the First International is founded as the International Working Men's Association, or IWA. You may have heard this before. And it was kind of a pivotal moment in the global labor movement. It brought together socialists, it brought together trade unionists, it brought together anarchists, and it sought to unite workers from across the world, regardless of national boundary. This is an international solidarity movement. And the idea here was that they would fight for their collective rights, but the problem was there was a contradiction at the heart of it, and this contradiction still remains. You get this split, this schism between Karl Marx, who advocates, and a lot of his followers advocated the same thing, a high degree of centralization and control, which develops into various forms of communism, notably Marxist-Leninism, which is eventually going to take over Russia and topple the monarchy in 1917. The other side of that split is mostly the followers of Mikhail Bakunin, who is one of the original classical anarchists. Bakunin is advocating a form of anarchism or stateless socialism. And Bakunin's main worry here, his major preoccupation, is that if you have a highly centralized movement, that will lead to corruption, the corruption of power. That is the heart of understanding anarchism. Any sort of power corrupts the individual, and he more or less predicts what's about to happen with these movements, especially in Russia, which ends up being co-opted by those in power, notably Stalin, who consolidates a tremendous amount of power and starts killing off his political opponents. So the First International is this watershed moment in the labor movement history, but it ends up being a major failure. And so there's this in the context as we go into the work of Goldman. The last thing we need to know about is the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair is tremendously important, especially for American anarchists. So the Haymarket Affair takes place in 1886. Emma Goldman at this point is already living in the United States, and she's quite young, but it does contribute to her radicalization. This is kind of a defining moment. in the history of labor and anarchist movements. So on May 4th in Haymarket Square, during a peaceful rally in Chicago, a bomb explodes. And it explodes during a bit of a confrontation between police and workers. It kills several officers and a few civilians. And the perpetrators were never actually found. However, 8 anarchist activists were arrested and 4 of them were killed after what is essentially a sham trial. It's the reason, by the way, that we have May 1st as May Day, or International Workers' Day. It commemorates the Haymarket Affair. So that's some relevant historical context before Emma Goldman comes in. Keep this in mind as we talk about her biography. Right. The Emma Goldman, and this may come as no surprise to you, but the Emma Goldman of the time, back when she was working in the press, she was portrayed as a dangerous radical, as angry and screeching, and sort of the classic archetype of a dangerous woman, right? In reality, she was just kind of lovely. She was focused, but she was also very warm, and we're going to talk about her life, starting in the Russian Empire. Like most of the best Americans, Goldman was born outside of the country. She was born in the Russian Empire, June 27, 1869, and she was born to a Jewish family in modern-day Lithuania. From the very beginning, she was dealing with a lot of extremely complicated family situations, and just in general, a deeply restrictive social environment that eventually drove her and her sister to emigrate to the United States. Actually, all 3 sisters emigrated to the United States because her other sister, her eldest sister, was already living there. Goldman moved when she was 16, and she moved in with her older sister, who was then living in Rochester, New York. And there she stays for a little bit. As a teenager, she was never really satisfied with her life. She married quite young, but she wasn't content to just be a woman at home performing the duties that were expected of her. And she also thought her husband, a man named Kirshner, could offer her something more, but he turned out to just be a dud. So she was looking for something else, something bigger. Things really changed in 1886, and we know what happened now in 1886. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago changed everything for young Emma Goldman. Emma watched the speeches of the men who were condemned to death, and it radicalized her. She moved to New Haven, Connecticut, not far from where I'm recording this video, by the way, and was independent for a time. She struck out on her own, but a bout of tuberculosis, which would pop up throughout the rest of her life, it forced her to move back with her sister, and after that, she managed to get away once again, and she moved to New York City. It's a little funny when we talk about some of these early theorists, because there is often a moment where the theorist will fall into a circle of leading lights and radicals and intellectuals. The same thing happened when we talked about Frantz Fanon and the Wretched of the Earth a little while ago, several books back. He fell into the leading lights of Paris's orbit, and that is exactly what happens with Emma Goldman. In New York City, she falls in with some dangerous radicals that like to congregate in the Lower East Side, especially at a cafe called Saks Cafe on Suffolk Street. And it was there that she meets Alexander Berkman. Berkman, by the way, also known as Sasha, also from the Russian Empire, also from modern-day Lithuania, and she moves in with him and his cousin Fedya, and they began sort of a strange three-way relationship that was ill-defined. It was quite complicated, but at the same time it was kind of working. Things really kick off for them, however, when workers in Homestead, Pennsylvania at the Carnegie Steel plant go on strike. This is a major turning point for the trio. Now, the chairman at the time, Henry Clay Frick, who is one of the industrial age's most evil villains, at least in the Americas, starts doing everything in his power to break the back of the strike. And that includes calling in Pinkerton detectives. It includes convincing the governor to go in with the state militias. Anything he can do, he declares that he'd rather see a striker dead than negotiate with their demands. And so the three, Fedya, Sasha, and Emma, decide to take matters into their own hands. It's Berkman that actually does the deed. With assistance and planning from Goldman and Fedya, Berkman tries and fails to kill Frick, and he's arrested and jailed for 14 years. It's around this time that public opinion really starts turning against anarchists. Goldman is, because of her involvement with Sasha Berkman, she becomes a prime target. Shortly after this, she's arrested while giving a speech in Philadelphia and extradited to New York. She's charged with inciting a riot during one of her speeches, and she's also charged as well with the disbelief in God and government, which is a little funny. Because of this, she spends a year in Blackwell's prison, and she's released in 1894. We are condensing Goldman's life here quite a bit, but there are two major events to mention after this point. The first is a European tour that she goes on when she's just 26 years old. And it's there that she meets some famous European thinkers. People like Peter Kropotkin, like Enrico Malatesta, like Louise Michel. This is an eye-opening moment for her. The second event that we should talk about briefly is the assassination of US President William McKinley. Crucially, the person who assassinated McKinley, this guy Leon Czolgosz, was a 28-year-old factory worker, and he said that he had seen Goldman speak before he goes to kill McKinley. And I mention this as well because we will get to this in the reading series because she mentions this event in her book. So we will talk about this at a later date. Now, because of Czolgosz, she's interrogated, she's briefly jailed, but ultimately she is released. And after this, she actually defends Czolgosz. But she shies away a little bit from defending the kind of murder that she had planned earlier with Sasha Berkman. We'll talk a little bit about this later. Anyway, throughout this period, we start to see Goldman become nationally famous and nationally recognized. And because of that, we also start to see the US actively looking for a way to get rid of her. She writes this at the time. She says, quote, "Poor United States government, yours is indeed a difficult task. You have Emma Goldman's citizenship, but she has the world, and her heritage is the kinship of brave spirits. Not a bad bargain." Now we should mention, of course she's worried. She's worried about this period. She's worried about leaving the United States and not being able to return. At this point, she's thinking about going to Australia to give a speaking tour. She ends up not going because she's very worried about her status as an immigrant and her vulnerability because of that. But publicly, she's defiant. In 1908, Goldman enters what can sort of be seen as a new era for her, a new level of her fame. She goes to Chicago just after an attempt on the life of the city's chief of police by Lazarus Averbrook. We will talk about that. This also comes up in this book. And she attended Averbrook's funeral, and it was there that she met a young Ben Reitman. Ben Reitman is a very important figure in Goldman's story. He becomes her manager, he becomes her lover, and also one of the greatest sources of torment in her life. There's an incredible book, by the way, that I'm drawing on pretty extensively called Love, Anarchy, and Emma Goldman. It's by Candace Falk, and it goes through this tumultuous relationship with Ben Reitman, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is a brilliant, brilliant read. So do feel free to check that out as well. Either way, it's there that she meets Reitman, and a new era kicks off. The thing with Reitman is, even as Goldman is preaching free love and talking about sex and love and anarchism, Reitman was off sleeping with other women, and that fills her with jealousy. So over this period in her life, she's wrestling with the practice of free love versus preaching about free love. But she also begins to lean heavily into the defense of things that at the time were considered impossible things to defend. She is speaking up for sex workers. She is defending homosexuality. She is talking about love itself as something potentially radical and revolutionary. It's then, in 1914, that Goldman starts becoming more involved in the birth control movement. And also Margaret Sanger, who she has a bit of a tumultuous relationship with. She clearly respected Sanger, who becomes very much the head and face of the birth control movement in the United States in the 1910s. But she's also very critical of Sanger and the way that Sanger is willing to cozy up to power to get her way. And also what we might call today sort of respectability politics. Goldman also had a huge ego, and she sort of resented Sanger for very much taking over this movement. Either way, Goldman gets arrested in the end over her birth control advocacy. This happens in 1916. And you see, at the time, the United States growing increasingly more repressive. And Goldman and people like her were starting to feel it as well, but she just keeps going. And it's at this point that she starts getting involved in the issue that would change the rest of her life, and that is the anti-preparedness movement. See, at this point, the United States is in the middle of a preparedness campaign. It's led by people like Teddy Roosevelt ahead of the US entry into World War I. That eventually happens in 1917. And for Goldman, 1917 was also huge because at the same time you have the Russian Revolution, which ends up overthrowing the monarchy, happening back in her home country of Russia. Goldman actually wants to go back and help, but she's very worried that if she goes, she might not be able to come back. So she stays in the US and continues giving these lectures and starts fighting for this anti-preparedness movement, which is essentially, at this point, an anti-war movement. One of the things that she opposes is the early draft, and she and Ben Reitman are both arrested over their opposition to the draft. Goldman is sentenced to 2 years in jail and was released pending appeal, but then things become even more complicated for her when the US passes the Espionage Act in 1917, and then the Anti-Anarchist Immigration Act of 1918, which makes things even more complicated. Now, the Anti-Anarchist Immigration Act of 1918 allows the government officially to deport foreign nationals who are involved in anarchism, quite broadly defined, in almost any way. So it's fairly doubtful that they would have lasted long. She, along with Sasha Berkman, they're both caught up in this net. And Goldman in particular is looked on very unfavorably by a young J. Edgar Hoover, who of course ends up taking over the Bureau of Investigation, which becomes the FBI. But J. Edgar Hoover takes an incredibly close interest in Goldman's case and wants to get her out of the country, and eventually both she and Sasha are deported back to Russia. So she officially leaves the United States in 1919. Initially, Goldman is actually fairly happy to be back in Russia. This is, again, right after an incredibly successful revolution. Vladimir Lenin is in charge. She starts working for the new government. There's a lot of excitement, and both she and Sasha Berkman are welcomed with open arms into this new Red Russia. However, she starts working for the new government, and as she's working for the new government, she realizes that things may not all be as they seem. For one thing, the new communist government had already thrown a bunch of notable anarchists who had supported the revolution into prison, and they're just sort of keeping them there arbitrarily. That, and the new government is getting more repressive by the day. You're starting to see a little bit of the early stirrings of what would become Stalinism later on. And she takes this, both of them, Sasha and Emma, take this to Lenin personally, and he essentially just dismisses them. So she ends up leaving. She leaves for Sweden and begins heavily criticizing the Soviet Union. And this is why a lot of people at the time on the left, and today on the left, still criticize Emma Goldman, is her stance against the Soviet Union. She comes out hard for something that was so important to the international labor movement, that's a kind of communist revolution could actually succeed somewhere. And here's Emma Goldman, a leading light of the anarchist movement, criticizing it directly. It's tough. But as far as Lenin's concerned, it was a little bit of a relief, probably. There's a Secret Service agent who's posing as an AP reporter in Russia at the time who writes that Trotsky and Lenin were both scared of Goldman. He says that she was too smart for them. Who knows if that's true, but either way, her views on the Soviet Union start making her a pariah in leftist circles. She starts having a lot of trouble getting things published. She moves to London in 1922 and she begins to work on a few books. She kicks off a few lecture tours, especially in Canada, but she couldn't really recapture the magic that she had as a younger woman in the United States. And she actually doesn't return to the US until 1933. And then she's only granted, finally, a 90-day visa to go into the United States, and it happens on the condition that she only talks about drama and theater and none of the politics stuff. Her application, by the way, was supported by many luminaries at the time, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who essentially said, listen, Emma Goldman is an old woman, and I think that you, the American public, can stand Goldman being in the country for a few days. Anyway, when she arrives back in the United States, the press goes crazy, and Emma Goldman kicks off a massive, incredibly well-attended lecture tour. And just a quote from the time, she's speaking at this packed event back in Rochester. And she's telling people that she's not a martyr. She says, "Please don't feel that I have made sacrifices, that I'm a martyr. I have followed my bent, lived my life as I chose, and no one owes me anything. I'm no more respectable than I ever was. It's you who have become a little more liberal, and it's never too late to progress. You are progressing." And after that, after this tour, she goes back to Europe to focus on her writing. Sadly for Goldman, Sasha Berkman dies. After wrestling with cancer for many years, he tries to commit suicide, but he misses his heart. He tries to shoot himself in the heart and he misses. He just goes a little bit astray, and so he lives for an extra 16 hours. And in that time, Emma Goldman rushes back to be with Sasha in his final moments, and she makes it back, but she falls into a deep depression afterwards. This is her constant companion in this fight. The one thing that maybe lifts her depression for a little bit is in 1936, the Spanish Civil War kicks off, and the Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, or CNT, asks Goldman to come in and help to communicate the goals of the revolution to an English-speaking audience. So Goldman accepts, and she goes to Spain, she goes to Barcelona, and the early Spanish Civil War is the period of incredible hope, especially in Barcelona, and Goldman found herself incredibly energized over this period. However, from the beginning, she is wary of the CNT, and she starts warning anarchists kind of privately. She counsels them to be wary of the communists. Possibly because of her experiences in Russia. She's learned to be a little concerned about this. But in the early days, everyone is working together. We won't go through the entire history of the Spanish Civil War, which is a fascinating history, but suffice to say that the CNT ends up stabbing the anarchists in the back, and it crushed Goldman. Now, she continued to defend the CNT in 1937 because it's part of this wave that's pushing back against fascism and the rise of Francisco Franco, who becomes the dictator of Spain after the CNT ends up falling. However, she privately worried in her defense of the CNT that had Sasha been alive, he would have judged her pretty hard for compromising on her principles here. Now, towards the end of her life, she finds herself reconciling with Ben Reitman, who we met earlier. As Ben Reitman had a stroke, and they come together a little bit towards the end. She's also completing some of her final works and going back to her old specialty, which was getting anarchists out of prison. She's working with some anarchists in Canada. And then, after a couple years, in 1940, she suffers a stroke, and the stroke leaves her without speech. So Emma Goldman ends up dying 3 months later, and her last intelligible words were Stella, the name of her niece and her constant companion, and Sasha. So that is the unbelievable and fairly crazy life of Emma Goldman. I wasn't kidding when I said that her work and her life crosses multiple huge earth-shattering events. She is flashy, she has an ego, she is out there in public, whereas a lot of her companions at the time would have preferred to do the work diligently in, silence or relative anonymity and just get the good work done. Goldman doesn't want that. She wants kind of glory and fame, and she wants to understand herself as part of the movement. And she is, of course, a hypocrite, a mass of contradictions. And that is what you get, especially if you read Falk's book, you get this portrait of Goldman as a deeply conflicted figure throughout this entire time. Somebody who is preaching something and does something else and can be quite hypocritical, but also at the same time a genius. To me, that doesn't necessarily undermine the work that she does. It just, if anything, makes our reading of this work more profound. And I also think that a lot of this stuff just demonstrates that Emma Goldman was human at the end of the day. So that ends the biography here. Let's look at some key issues to keep in mind as you read this book. We got to talk about feminism. Feminism is a cornerstone in her thoughts. Goldman is a staunch feminist who managed to alienate many, many people in the feminist movement of her time. You may be surprised by some of her stances, particularly her stance against women's suffrage, or at least the women's suffrage movement. But it's because Goldman sees these things as multifaceted. She sees these things kind of holistically. She believes that women, of course, should be allowed to vote, but she doesn't think it's going to change anything. As long as the political system stays the same, she has no confidence that anything will change. And she also sees the feminist movement at the time as being caught up in being respectable and trying to demonstrate their seriousness to men. And meanwhile, Goldman at the same time is out there defending prostitution. There are quotes from sex workers in the Falk book that talk about how Goldman radicalized them in an understanding of themselves and who they could be. This is the work of Goldman. This is what she is really interested in doing. We should also talk about prisons. The modern prison abolition movement has a lot in common with what Goldman was talking about way back then in the 1800s. She hated prisons, hated what they stood for, hated what they were used for. It's worth mentioning as well that this was personal to her. She had been in prison numerous times. Friends and colleagues and comrades that she had worked with were also in prison for extended periods of time. This is a lifelong battle for her. So as you read this book, and there is a specific section about prisons in this book, but we'll talk about that, but just keep in mind that this is the context that she's coming from. We should also talk about political violence. Political violence with Goldman is a little tricky. So she believes in its usefulness. She early on helps plan the murder of Henry Clay Frick. We talked about this with Sasha Berkman, but she starts to distance herself a little bit over time, and it's a little unclear what her position is later on. In letters between her and Ben Reitman, she is defending this idea of political violence, which he is trying to distance himself from completely, but she hangs on to this idea. For her, this is just sort of the natural outcome of the world that we live in. And she sort of says, well, you can decry violence. If you want to end political violence, you have to change the system itself. She wrote this to Reitman. She says, quote, "About myself, I hold this position. Violence is inevitable. Never mind what Jesus said. But it is not so because it is part of anarchism, but because it is thrust upon the individual and the masses by conditions." Now, for education, Goldman was profoundly influenced by the death of one man, Francisco Ferrer. He is a Spanish, or Catalan actually, educator who set up anarchist schools, and he ends up dying for it. Now, you will read her thoughts on Ferrer here, but she simply believes that education must be something more. That it just can't be about learning facts that will serve us in the workplace, but it must be a process of growth and exploration, something that affirms our humanity. This is really core to Goldman's thoughts. Lastly, we can't talk about Goldman without talking about sex and love. You will hear a lot about this in this book, but for now, just suffice to say that for Goldman, sex and love and free love and connections between people, and then when she starts talking about marriage and how it can be a prison of its own, things like that, for Goldman, sex and love are fundamentally revolutionary things that happen in our lives. And so for Goldman, sex, love, and anarchism are inextricably intertwined. The political is personal for Goldman, and this sort of thing has to be read on those terms. In fact, Goldman wrestled and tangled with people like Peter Kropotkin, who she attends his funeral back in Russia when he dies. This is a hugely important figure to her. But she clashes with Kropotkin on this idea of whether you can separate love and the revolution. So those are just previews to the things that we will talk about in this reading series. I am really excited to get into it. Again, go check out that Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. We'll read through all of this. We will talk through all of this. We will get into Goldman properly. And I could not be more excited to talk about all this stuff with you. Let me know what you think as always. Thank you for watching, and I will see you very soon.